So, first I want to start off by saying thank you Tracy and to Pete and to Leslie for having me out here. It's been a great visit so far. I'll have to say I've been in Iowa for 24 hours. I haven't met a single presidential candidate. Clearly disappointed in this visit. Before we get going too, we talked a little bit at lunch how they rate some of these events that go on fairness. And this panel was rated as fair, and I think it's because I did my graduate work at Michigan State. Yeah, I'm laying it down now. But this is very fair, so you let a Spartan come, right? And so this is a very great, nice thing to do. So please don't hold that against me and ask me very difficult questions. As a Spartan, I can't answer them. So I was asked today to sort of give a little bit of an overview of redistricting and perhaps touch on a little bit about what some of my esteemed colleagues are going to talk about in their talks. Here's my clicker. And so first just talk a little bit about redistricting, the process, some constraints, and why it matters. So redistricting is supposed to happen in a 10-year cycle. So every 10 years we have a census. We count up the entire population. In this process, we actually have to count individual noses, so we go around. It'd actually be more accurate if we estimated how many people there were, but according to the Constitution, we have to actually go around and count. It's my opinion, the census is actually like a very inaccurate measure, right? So it takes place over the course of a year. So during that time, people die, people are born, lots of people are counted multiple times. I think about college students, right? So if you're a college student in the dorm in an apartment, you're going to get the form. It's going to come to you, or the worker's going to come and say how many people live here, and they're going to count you up. A different worker is going to go to your parents' house, and they're going to say how many people live here. And their parents are going to say, well, I'm paying for that kid, in college. There's one down in the basement, there's another. And so some people are counted multiple times. Other people are missed. Right? So you might have homeless are missed. You might have people who don't want the government to count them for whatever reason are missed. Other groups of people that are missed are people who are overseas. And this actually it turns out to be important. A lot of people in the state of Utah go on missions for multiple years, and they're not counted. Utah missed out on a representative. They were to get the next person if all the people overseas doing mission were counted. So in some ways, it's a very flawed process, but it's the one that we use. So we have our census. We count up everyone in the country as best as possible. And then we divide up the districts amongst the states. For many states, they remain the same. They get the same number of seats from year to year. Some pick up. My colleague from California knows California frequently gains seats. I have another colleague from Texas. Texas is usually the winner in this process, I think. They're getting a lot of seats. I'm originally from New York. We've been slowly over the years losing seats. Seats have been moving south, and they've been moving west. In some ways, this affects our political process. So we have more people living in states that tend to be more conservative. Now, some of those states, maybe a state like North Carolina, a lot of people from New York moved. North Carolina is kind of in the middle sometimes. Sometimes it's red, but it's also gone blue now and again. So the way people move around the country and the way seats are divided up can influence our outcomes at the end. So how does this process work? Most redistricting is done by legislatures. So the general process is move forward as some sort of bill where plans are introduced, there's debate, there might be some revisions, it has to pass both chambers, and then some states it has to go to the governor, some states it does not. Some states, when you have unified control, so a state like Oklahoma, where the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, you're going to have a plan that's going to be very good for the Republicans, right? They're a bit of a Republican gerrymander. In the few states that are controlled by all Democrats, you're going to get a Democratic gerrymander. I lived in Georgia for a while, and the Democrats hung on and hung on and hung on, and they really gerrymandered that state in favor of the Democrats. Now the Republicans then take control eventually of the House, of the Senate, the governorship, and they gerrymander it back the other way in favor of the Republicans. So this gerrymandering is not, a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It's a partisan thing. In some instances, the the state has divided government, so perhaps the Democrats control the legislature, and you have a Republican governor, or the two chambers are split. And you usually get what we call an incumbent protection plan, where they just decide to return everyone to office, right? Sort of that's the plan that can work. When I lived in New York, there was a very long standing between the state house and the state senate, where the state house would draw their districts and it would be Democratic, and the state senate would draw their districts, and it would be Republican. So the state senate in New York was Republican for a long time, until actually you got a couple people that sort of caucused with the other party. There's actually a great controversy where they did not know who controlled the Senate. There's a couple people who decided to caucus with the Republican Party, probably giving them control, but two of those people were under indictment. Now maybe four of them. If you follow New York politics, most everyone's under indictment at one time or another. But anyway, so sometimes it's a little unclear what's going to happen. So that's I'd say the standard way is the legislature does it, and you either end up with an incumbent protection plan, or you end up with a partisan gerrymander. Another outcome or another way you can do this is through commissions. You guys are probably more familiar with the Iowa Commission than I am. Iowa Commission is generally what we call an advisory commission. So they come up with the plan, and it does have to be approved by the legislature. There's other states like California, which I'll only touch on briefly. My colleagues could talk about that they have a more independent process. Arizona also has a fairly independent redistricting commission. There's some commissions that are very partisan, where they'll pick members from the Democratic Party, members from the Republican Party, and they'll try to draw districts. New Jersey has a partisan side with Democrats and Republicans, and then they have to pick a tiebreaker. For a number of years, it was a political scientist. Larry Bartels was the tiebreaker from Princeton for a number of years. I don't know who was the tiebreaker the last time around. Rosenthal has been the tiebreaker as well. So political scientists can matter sometimes. And sometimes the plans get thrown into the courts, and many cases end up getting thrown. Plans end up getting thrown into the courts for violating some sort of rule or another. I've done some research on this, looking at courts and commissions and legislatures, and looking at who draws the plan and the outcomes, and looking over a long time frame. When you take the process outside the legislature, the outcomes tend to be more competitive. Now, they're not extremely competitive. I don't think it's a panacea. But if you want to increase competition, I would say you want to take the process out of the legislature. It doesn't happen all the time. Commissions overall in 2012, the elections weren't any more competitive than legislative drawn districts. Some years they are, some years they're not. Some states they are, some states they're not. But over sort of long history, these methods give us a little bit more competition. So in redistricting, we're operating under some constraints. The first constraint is equal population. So within a state, the populations of the congressional districts have to be as equal as you can make them. So if there's a plan and someone wants to sue and say that plan is not fair, the first thing you're probably going to look at is, are the populations different? And if they are, you probably have a decent shot at a case. I think there's a case in Arizona where there's a balance between sort of racial redistricting and the Voting Rights Act and equal population, and so the case is being brought on the populations are different. So states or districts have to be contiguous, so you can't have part of a district over here and part of a district over here. They have to be connected in one way or another. Now that connection can be in interstates, right, as long as there's a physical connection. My favorite district was actually, it was in California. I have favorite districts. And the story goes, it was only connected during low tide. And I don't know like if they sued or what happened with that, but I thought it was a pretty interesting case. Every once in a while, they'll draw these districts and they'll forget a town, right? So there's actually these legal definitions that they'll list, like the streets and the counties and what belongs to what. It's not the drawing of the map. You have to have like sort of this legal definition. Every once in a while, they'll forget a city or a town, and we'll just have to revise the law and say, yes, it needs to go there. So that's the other like real constraint. I guess the third is the Voting Rights Act. And one of my colleagues is going to talk a little bit more about the Voting Rights Act and the Shelby case. But sort of in a simplistic way, you're not allowed to draw districts that make it too difficult for minority voters to elect someone of their choice. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at that. But that's another constraint that a lot of states are under. There's been this recent case, the Shelby case, it pulls that back a little bit. I'll leave it at that. Some people have sort of a wish list, like how could we make redistricting better, or what could we do to improve it? One is, could we have more competitive districts? And the answer is maybe yes in some places. So the standard line you're going to get from political scientists is redistricting isn't the problem, it's really where everybody lives. So Democrats tend to cluster in cities, and Republicans tend to live everywhere else. So it's fairly easy to draw kind of normal looking districts with lots of Democrats in some districts, and they're sort of out of the cities, and then districts filled with Republicans who are filling the rest of the places. So that's sort of something people want. It's to be a little harder to get than you want. You can't just say like, well, can't you just draw these competitive districts? It's not that simple. What else do people want? No funny shapes. People seem to look at funny shaped districts and think like, well, that's a bad thing. I don't know if that's necessarily good or bad, but people want normal looking districts. That's easy in some places. I think it's easier in Iowa, right? You have nice square counties, so you can draw these nice square-ish looking districts. I live in Oklahoma. I'll show you some maps. We're not quite as square. We have some rivers that change things. And then other people, and I think this is important, want to keep cities and towns intact, right? So you don't want to draw a line through the middle of a city, especially a smaller city, and half the people are in one district and half are in another. I taught previously at the University of Texas at Dallas, and they actually split the campus. So the freshman dorm was in, it was in Pete Sessions' district, and the rest of the campus was in Johnson's district. So it was great. I can invite 2 members of Congress to like campus, and I had a reason for them to be there, but it makes it a little confusing for voters sometimes. So just real quick, this is the plans that some different states use, and I already talked about this. So California, Arizona, Washington, and Idaho use a fairly independent redistricting commission method. I'd say it's important, very important in a state like California because there's lots of districts. An independent commission in Idaho, especially at the congressional level, is not that important, right? I mean, you're going to change that line just a little bit, year to year. Also probably important in a state like Arizona. You can see the normal method, all these states, is with the legislature, and then we have different kinds of commissions. And so I'm just going to jump through that. I was asked too to talk a little bit about how is this redistricting going to influence the upcoming election. So I'm going to do that by looking at maps from Oklahoma from 1950. I'm not one for normally listening to directions, so I work at the Carl Albert Center, amongst other things, is an archive. So I did a little search for redistricting, and I found these maps from the 1950 plan. And so we like to think of like, oh, redistricting, it's this new thing, it's making politics really terrible, but it's not. Redistricting is something that's gone on the entire history of our country, right? So the gerrymander comes from a Massachusetts state legislative race, from over 200 years ago. And there's been gerrymandering and redistricting over this long time period. So first, just here's the original plan. This is House Bill 78 from Oklahoma, where they just have the districts and the population. And so that's the original plan that's introduced. Very quickly, I guess this is up here, someone offers an amendment. So I'm not going to go through all the lines, but they say, let's just change the lines a little bit, right? And so they didn't like the original plan, let's offer an amendment. So even in the 50s, there was fights over how we're going to draw the lines. How does the process actually work? So in the 50s, you took your map, you took your pen, and you would draw the districts. Now today, people like to say, oh, look, we have GIS. It makes it so easy to do gerrymandering. You can gerrymander just as easily in the 1950s with a red pen, right? In any state, there's a handful of people who know every single neighborhood, right? They know every single county. They know how they vote. They don't even need to look at any data, right? They can come up with a plan that's going to be advantageous to them. right? They can do it just as easily with a marker as they can do with a sophisticated GIS program. And maybe it's a little easier with the GIS programs, but you can get any outcome that you want without this sort of sophisticated algorithm. So the Democrats had their own plan here. I assume the Republicans had an option that they wanted to come up with. One thing I want to point out is prior to 1964, we had some cases, the Westbury v. Sanders case, the Baker v. Carr case. Districts did not have to be equal in population. And so this map points out these vast disparities in the sizes of the district. So District 2 here, this includes Tulsa, is up here, has 487,000 people in it. Right, so that's a fair amount of people. District 6, which is out in the panhandle of Oklahoma, nobody lives there. It's fairly large geographically and only has 222,000 people, right? So like, we think of like one person, one vote is fundamental to American democracy. It wasn't until 1964 that sort of became part of what we do. And so this is a good example. If you look at maps of Georgia, you're going to find similar things. Any state that has cities and then a rural population, it tends to have rural districts with fewer voters, urban districts with more voters. So I'll just jump through the rest of the maps here. What do we care about 2016? I would say advantage Republicans. And so the main reason the Republicans are advantaged is they drew the districts in 2012. So in 2008, 2010, the Republicans put a lot of time, effort, money into winning state legislatures and into winning governor's offices, right? And so they did this so they knew they would control redistricting for the 2012 election. They got to draw the lines, they draw districts that were advantageous to them, and we're going to see this reverberate throughout all the elections. It's going to make it harder for the Democrats to take control of the House, right? If I had to place a bet who's going to control the House in 2016 or after the 2016 election, it's going to be the Republicans. It's going to be really hard for the Democrats to take back because they didn't control the lines. So they drew 40% of the seats in 2010. The Democrats only controlled or drew 10%, and the remaining 50% sort of a mixed between divided courts and commissions. If we look at sort of an early guess at who's going to win these seats, 170 seats are safe for Democrats, 209 seats are safe for Republicans. You only need 218 to control the House. Right, so the Republicans are basically starting off with 209 in the pocket and just need to win 9 more. So I think there's a pretty good chance that they're going to be able to do that. So is redistricting a problem? In some ways, yes, right? So there's an argument that too many representatives are safe. Representative Loebsack made this argument at the beginning. He asked us, hey, if you think I'm wrong, please send me the information. There's actually a lot of political science literature that says, redistricting isn't really the root cause of polarization. Professor Brunel has written a book that says having safe representatives in some ways is good, right? If you're a constituent of that district, it's great, right? Especially if you voted for that person, right? You have a representative that represents you really well in the Congress. And so, if redistricting was a problem, if people were really upset with the Congress, we'd see incumbents losing left and right, but we don't, right? They're getting reelected at pretty high rates. So generally the argument is, look, redistricting is bad in all the other districts. In my district, it's doing the right thing. So in some ways, this can be good for representation if lots of people have a person that's representing their views, and we're just upset at all the other members of Congress. Questions of, can we make races more competitive and less gerrymandered? California has tried a system that does this with an independent commission. California, some other states, they've changed the state constitutions. I'm sorry, I might be wrong about California, but some states have changed the state constitutions that say, look, one of the things you have to try to do in drawing districts is try to make them competitive. So you can impose additional constraints to change the districting process. So California has tried this. And I think Dr. Brunel is also going to talk about some other avenues for reform. So I'm going to leave it at that, let my colleagues talk about some more specific cases as well, and we'll move on.